1. The flood is over. The water has pulled back from the mountains. The mud is still drying on the plains of what will one day be called Mesopotamia. 8 people walk off a wooden boat onto a world that has been scrubbed clean. A world with no cities, no kings, no temples, no armies. Just wet ground and silence and the smell of cedar and animals and the impossible weight of starting over. Noah plants a vineyard. His sons spread out across the earth. Grandchildren are born. Great-grandchildren. The table of nations in Genesis 10 gives you 70 names, 70 lines of descent spreading like roots across the ancient world. Shem goes east. Japheth goes north and west. Ham goes south. And then, buried in the middle of this quiet genealogical record, a name appears that does not read like the others. Most of these names are just names. A man is born, he lives, he has sons, he dies. The text moves on. But when you reach verse 8 of chapter 10, something shifts. The rhythm of the text changes. Moses, writing under the Spirit, stops the genealogical roll call and does something he has not done for any other name on this list. He tells you a story. Just 4 verses. 4 verses inside a chapter that is otherwise nothing but names and territories and begats. 4 verses that, if you know how to read them, explain the architecture of evil for the rest of the entire Bible. The man's name is Nimrod. And here is the first thing you need to know about him. He is not a myth. He is not a legend borrowed from Mesopotamian folklore. He is a historical figure, a real man, a real king. And his shadow stretches from the first pages of Genesis all the way to the last pages of Revelation. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, describes him in his Antiquities of the Jews as a man who deliberately turned the hearts of people away from God, not through ignorance, not through weakness, but through intention. Josephus says he was bold and strong, and that he changed the government into tyranny. He didn't stumble into opposition against God. He chose it. He built it. He systematized it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand Nimrod, you have to understand where he came from. Because in the Bible, bloodlines carry weight, and Nimrod's bloodline carries something very specific. His father was Cush. His grandfather was Ham. And Ham was the son of Noah. You remember what happened with Ham. After the flood, Noah plants his vineyard, makes wine, drinks too much, and falls asleep uncovered in his tent. Ham sees his father's nakedness and, instead of covering him, goes outside and tells his brothers. There is debate among scholars about exactly what Ham did in that tent, but what is not debated is Noah's response when he wakes up. He pronounces a curse, not on Ham directly, and this is interesting, but on Ham's son Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. The curse does not land on Cush. Nimrod's father escapes the specific words of that pronouncement, but the moral trajectory of Ham's line has been established. Ham saw what should not be seen. Ham told what should not be told. Ham is a man who, when given the chance to honor his father, chose exposure instead. And from that line, from that family where dishonor was a choice and shame was a tool, comes Nimrod. Stay with me, because there is one detail hiding in 4 Hebrew words that changes everything you think you know about this man. We are going to get to it. But not yet. First, let's look at what the text actually says about him. Because most people who have heard the name Nimrod have never actually read these 4 verses carefully. They have heard him referenced in sermons, maybe. Seen the name in a footnote. But the 4 verses themselves read slowly, in sequence, tell a story that is more disturbing and more important than most Bible teachers stop long enough to unpack. Verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. That phrase, he began to be, is worth pausing on. In Hebrew, it carries the sense of a transition, a becoming. There was a Nimrod before this moment, and then there was a different Nimrod after. Something changed in this man. Something started. And what started was a kind of greatness, but a greatness that, as you are about to see, was pointed in a very specific direction. 2. The Hebrew word translated mighty in verse 8 is Gibor. It is one of the most loaded words in the entire Old Testament. Gibor means warrior, champion, man of outstanding power and valor. It is the same word used for the mighty men of David, the 37 elite soldiers who fought alongside the king, men with names and legends attached to each of them. It is the word used in Isaiah 9:6 for the coming Messiah himself. Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, Mighty God, El Gibor, Mighty God. So when Moses uses Gibor for Nimrod, he is not saying Nimrod was impressive in a general sense. He is saying Nimrod stood in a category of human power that the ancient world recognized immediately. A Gibor was not a strong man. A Gibor was a force. Verse 9 tells you what kind of force. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, if you grew up hearing this verse in Sunday school, you may have been told that Nimrod was a great hunter of wild animals, bears, lions, the dangerous predators that threatened early settlements, and that before the Lord simply meant God approved of his hunting, or that he did it publicly, in full view of the community. A civic hero, a protector of people. That reading is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. And the incompleteness is the whole problem, because the word translated before in that phrase is the Hebrew preposition lephne, and lephne is a complicated word. It can mean in front of in the sense of visibility, but it also carries the meaning of in the face of, against, in opposition to, in defiance of. The same preposition appears in Deuteronomy 9, where God says certain nations were driven out before Israel, not to honor them, but because they were standing in the way. It appears in the stories of Israel's enemies who stood before the ark, not worshiping it, but opposing it. Josephus saw this. Writing in the 1st century, he says Nimrod was a man who persuaded people that it was their own courage, and not God's providence, that had kept them safe. He convinced a generation that they did not need God, that they were themselves sufficient. Josephus writes that Nimrod promised to exact revenge on God if he should try to drown the world again, and that the tower was partly an act of defiance, a man-made mountain to outlast any divine flood. Here's what most people miss. The phrase, mighty hunter before the Lord, is not a compliment wrapped in religious language. It is a description of a man who took the Gibor, that rare and terrible human power, and aimed it directly at heaven. He was not hunting animals. He was hunting souls. And he was very, very good at it. Verse 10. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar, 4 cities, each one a brick in the foundation of what will become the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. Babel, you know this name. Erech, which the Greeks will later call Uruk, one of the oldest cities on record. Akkad, which gives its name to the Akkadian Empire. Calneh, whose location archaeologists still debate. All of them in Shinar, the flat, alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates that we now call Iraq. This is Nimrod's first building project. And then, verse 11, out of that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh. Nineveh, you know that name too. The city so wicked that God sends a reluctant prophet named Jonah to preach to it. The city whose walls, according to ancient historians, were so thick that 3 chariots could ride side by side along the top. The city that Nahum calls the bloody city, full of lies and plunder. Nineveh, one of the most violent, most powerful, most spiritually corrupted cities in all of ancient history. Nimrod built it. One man, one generation after the flood. Before the mud from Noah's world had even fully dried, one man plants the seeds of every empire, every city, every power structure that will spend the next 2,000 years in direct opposition to the purposes of God. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. And here is the pattern. Every time the Bible shows you a city built in defiance of God, you are looking at something Nimrod started. Babylon, Nineveh, the entire system of human empire building that the Bible calls, in the book of Revelation, the great prostitute. It all has one address. It all has one founder. And God watched him do it. Which raises the question you may already be asking. Why? Why did God let this happen? Why, after going to the trouble of the flood, after wiping the earth clean and starting fresh with one righteous family, why did God allow one man to rebuild the entire architecture of human rebellion in a single generation? We will get there. But first, if this video is landing for you, if you have never heard Nimrod's story told this way before, I want you to stay with it through the next section, because the most important part is still ahead. 3. Genesis 11 does not name Nimrod. That is important to say clearly. The text does not explicitly say, Nimrod built the Tower of Babel. Scholars debate this. Some say the tower came before Nimrod's rise. Some say it came after. Some say Nimrod organized it directly. Some say he was simply the cultural and political force whose leadership made it possible. But here is what the text does tell you. Genesis 11 opens with the whole earth having one language and one set of words. The people settle in. Where? Shinar. Nimrod's territory. Nimrod's cities. And they say to one another, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Let us make a name for ourselves. There are 3 things packed into that one sentence that would have made every ancient reader's hair stand up. First, the ambition, a tower to heaven. This was not engineering for its own sake. The ancient world built ziggurats, step tower temples, as meeting points between earth and the divine realm. This was not a tower to look at God. This was a tower to stand beside God, to be on his level, to be, in some sense, his equal. Second, the name. Let us make a name for ourselves. In Genesis, names carry identity, destiny, authority. God names things. Adam, Israel, the stars themselves. To make your own name is to claim the authority that belongs to God. It is the oldest ambition in the world. You heard it first in a garden. You will be like God. Third, the fear behind the project, lest we be dispersed. God had told humanity to fill the earth, to scatter, to multiply across every corner of creation. The tower was not just ambition upward. It was defiance outward, a refusal to obey the command that had been given, a consolidation of power in one place, under one vision, with one agenda. And here is what God says when he sees it. This is one of the most quietly terrifying sentences in Scripture. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. God is not threatened. Let's be clear about that. God does not panic, but he looks at what unified, organized, God-defying human ambition produces, and he says, this must be interrupted, not because he cannot handle it, but because he is merciful. Because if this continues, what humanity will build next will be worse, far worse. So he scatters them. And here is the thing that most sermons skip past. God does not destroy the tower. He does not call down fire. He does not flood the earth again. He simply confuses the language, and the project collapses. Not because God overpowered them, but because God removed the one thing that made them dangerous, their unity. Pay attention to this. The weapon God uses against Babel is not judgment. It is division. And the reversal of Babel, the answer to it, the undoing of it, does not come until the book of Acts, chapter 2. Pentecost. When the Spirit falls on a room full of people and suddenly every person hears the gospel in their own language. What Babel broke apart, the Spirit puts back together. But this time, the unity is not around a tower. It is around a name. Not the name they wanted to make for themselves, the name that is above every name. But that is later, much later. For now, the people scatter. The cities sit half-built. The tower stands unfinished against the sky. And Nimrod, whatever his role in what just happened, remains. His kingdom remains. His cities remain. And the spirit he represented, the organized, systematic, empire-building defiance of God, does not die with the scattering. It goes with the people. It spreads into every culture, every nation, every corner of the ancient world. You can trace it. From Babylon to Egypt, from Egypt to Assyria, from Assyria to Persia, from Persia to Greece, from Greece to Rome. Every empire that dominates the pages of the Old Testament carries the fingerprints of what started in Shinar, in Nimrod's cities, in the generation after the flood. This is not ancient history. This is a template. 4. Here is where it gets remarkable. Nimrod dies. At some point, the text does not give us a date, does not describe his death. This Gibber, this empire builder, this hunter who aimed his power at the face of God, dies. As all men do, as all empires eventually do. But his name does not die. 1,000 years after Genesis 10, the prophet Micah is writing about the coming Messiah. He describes the ruler who will come from Bethlehem, the one who will shepherd Israel and stand as peace when the Assyrian invades. And then, in Micah 5:6, he uses a phrase that stops you cold if you are paying attention. He calls Assyria the Land of Nimrod. 1,000 years later, the man has been dead for a millennium, and his name is still attached to the land he claimed, still defining the geography of empire, still present in the prophetic imagination of Israel as a symbol, not just of a person, but of a system, a spirit, a way of organizing human power in opposition to divine authority. The Assyrian Empire that Micah is writing about, the one that will eventually carry the northern tribes of Israel into captivity. It traces its founding city to Nimrod. Nineveh, the bloody city. The city Nimrod built when he moved out of Shinar and went north. And then, centuries further still, John is writing from a black volcanic rock called Patmos, exiled by Rome, writing the last book of the Bible. And the great enemy of God's people in Revelation is not called Rome, even though Rome is clearly in view. It is called Babylon, the mother of harlots, the city drunk on the blood of the saints. Babylon, Nimrod's first city, the name of the first place this man planted his flag. This is the open loop resolving now. This is the detail hidden in 4 Hebrew words that I told you we would return to. A mighty hunter before the Lord, Lefne Yahweh, in the face of God. The translators who render this phrase as a compliment, as if Nimrod was simply a devout hunter doing his work openly before God's gaze, are missing what the original language is carrying. The same phrase, Lefne, is used in contexts of confrontation, of standing against. The ancient Jewish interpretation, carried by Josephus, carried by the Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation of the Torah, renders it as Nimrod being mighty in opposition to the Lord, a rebel, a challenger. He was the first man in history to take organized human power and point it directly at God's face. And Revelation tells you that the last organized human power before Christ returns will have the same address, the same name, the same spirit. Babylon, the city of the man who stood against the Lord. This is why the Bible spends so much time on Nimrod. Not because he was the biggest villain in terms of body count. Later empires would surpass him in violence, but because he was the architect. He drew the blueprints. He proved it was possible to build an entire civilization on the foundation of human pride, collective power, and deliberate God defiance. And to make it look, from the outside, like progress, he was not hunting animals. He was hunting the loyalty of human hearts, and he was extraordinarily effective. But here is what you must hold on to as we move toward the end of this story. Nimrod built Babylon, and Babylon fell, every single time. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the one that destroyed Jerusalem, that carried Daniel into captivity, that seemed utterly unconquerable, fell to Cyrus the Persian in a single night. The book of Daniel describes it. Belshazzar is drinking from the stolen vessels of God's temple. The hand writes on the wall, and by morning the empire is finished. 1,000 years of Babylonian power ended between sunset and sunrise. The Rome that John was writing about from Patmos, the Rome that fed Christians to lions, that crucified the Son of God, that seemed as permanent as stone, is a ruin today. You can walk through it. You can buy a coffee and sit in the shadow of the Colosseum and watch pigeons land on the same stones that once held the machinery of the world's greatest empire. Every tower falls. Every name that humanity makes for itself. Every attempt to build a civilization without God at the center, to organize human power against divine authority, it ends. It always ends. 5. There is one more thread. Because the same generation that watched Nimrod build his empire, or very close to it depending on how you read the chronology, is the generation that produced a man named Abram. The Jewish and early Christian chronologies place Abraham's birth within a century or two of Nimrod's height of power. Some traditions place them as near contemporaries. And where does Abraham come from? Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur, a city in the same Mesopotamian plain as Nimrod's Babel, a city in Shinar, a city soaked in the culture, the religion, the ziggurat building, idol-worshipping, empire-shaped world that Nimrod built. Abraham grew up inside Nimrod's world. And then God spoke to him. Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. No address given, no map, no explanation of the destination, just leave. Leave the land of Nimrod. Leave the city with the ziggurat on the horizon. Leave the world where humans build towers to make names for themselves, where kings hunt the loyalty of souls, where the whole organizing principle of civilization is the accumulation of human power in the face of God. And Abraham went. The text says simply, "So Abram departed." No argument, no negotiation, no request for more information. He packed his tent and he left. This is not a small thing. This is the counter-move. This is God's answer to Nimrod. Nimrod said, "Let us gather." God told Abraham, "Scatter yourself. Go." Nimrod said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." God told Abraham, "I will make your name great." Nimrod said, "We will build our own security, our own tower, our own future." God told Abraham, "I will be your shield and your very great reward." Every promise in Nimrod's project, God reoffers to Abraham, and fulfills it. But not through consolidation of power, through a single man walking out of a city following a voice he could not see. Here is the second CT. TA I want to place here, right at the edge of this moment, because I do not want you to scroll past what just happened. If you have been watching this channel and this kind of deep dive into the architecture of Scripture is what you are hungry for, subscribe. Hit the notification bell, because we are going to keep pulling on these threads. But do not miss the weight of this scene. Abraham leaving Ur is not just a biographical detail. It is a declaration. It is God saying to Nimrod's entire system, "I have a different plan, not a tower, a family, not an empire, a covenant, not a name you make for yourself, a name I give to you." And from that one man, from that one act of obedience, that one departure from Nimrod's world, comes Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, the nation of Israel, the line of David, and ultimately the one who John the Baptist calls the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Nimrod built cities. God built a family. Nimrod aimed his power at the face of God. God aimed his love at the face of humanity. And there is a direct line, traceable, historical, documented in the text itself, between the man who left Nimrod's city and the manger in Bethlehem. This is not coincidence. This is architecture. This is the Bible doing what only the Bible does, taking a 4-verse footnote in a genealogy chapter and pulling a thread through it that connects all the way from the mud after the flood to the empty tomb outside Jerusalem. 6. So what do you do with Nimrod? What do you do with a man who appears in 4 verses, who the Bible never quotes, never interviews, never gives a death scene, and yet whose shadow falls across every page from Genesis to Revelation? You learn from him, and you watch yourself. Because Nimrod is not as far away as you think. Every time you have watched a culture, your culture, the one you live inside, organize itself around human achievement, around the accumulation of power, around the idea that we can build our way to security and significance without God at the center, you have seen Nimrod's blueprint in action. The tower changes shape. The language changes. But the project is the same. Make a name. Consolidate power. Stand in the face of the Lord. This is not just political. This is personal. Every one of us has a Babel inside us, a project we are building to make ourselves significant, to secure our own future, to make sure we are never scattered, never vulnerable, never dependent on something we cannot control. And God's answer to that project has not changed. He does not destroy it immediately. He lets it rise. He watches. And then, at the right moment, He confuses it. He scatters it. Not because He is cruel, but because He is merciful. Because the tower you are building, however impressive it looks from the outside, will not hold your weight when the ground shakes. 3 things to take with you. First, power without God always builds towers, and towers always fall. This is not a metaphor. This is documented history. Babylon fell. Nineveh fell. Rome fell. And every tower humanity has built since Nimrod, every system, every empire, every civilization, organized around the idea that human power is sufficient, has the same appointment with gravity. If what you are building is not built on the foundation God provides, you are not building a legacy. You are building a ruin that has not fallen yet. Second, God's answer to Babel was not judgment. It was Pentecost. The scattering was not the end of the story. The confusion of language was not God's final word on human unity. His final word came in an upper room on a Sunday morning, 50 days after Passover, when wind filled a house and fire sat on human heads, and people from every nation heard the same truth in their own language. What Nimrod tried to force through consolidation, the Spirit accomplished through multiplication. God did not fix Babel by gathering everyone back to Shinar. He fixed Babel by sending His Spirit into every language, every people, every corner of the earth. The church is not a tower. It is a fire. And fire spreads. Third, and this is the one I want you to carry. The man who hunted against God could not outrun the God who hunts for you. Nimrod was a Gibor, a mighty hunter. He took that power and aimed it at heaven. And heaven did not flinch. Heaven did not panic. Heaven simply outlasted him. And the same God who watched Nimrod build his empire, who watched the tower rise and scattered the workers, who called Abraham out of Ur and made a covenant with a wandering shepherd, that God is still hunting, still searching, still calling people out of every empire, every tower, every system of human pride that promises security but delivers only stone. Jesus says it plainly in Luke 19. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost, to seek, to hunt. The same word, the same image, the same Gibber energy, but aimed not at the face of God in defiance, but at the face of humanity in love. Nimrod hunted against the Lord, and the Lord hunted for Nimrod's world. This is not a story about a villain. It is not a story about 4 verses. It is not even a story about Babylon. This is a story about a God who refuses to be outrun by human pride, who watches every tower rise, who lets every empire have its moment, and who, in the fullness of time, steps into the same world Nimrod built and says, I am not here to scatter you this time. I am here to gather you. Not around a tower, around a cross,